What is going to happen now is that we will have 3 presentations without any interruptions, actually. And that means that you will need to save your questions and your comments until the presenters have finished their presentation. We will have 30 minutes at the end of the session where the 3 presenters will come up here, and we will all be able to ask them questions and comment their presentations. For those of you who are online, you can just at any time announce a comment or a question in the chat, and then we will invite you later on then to present your comments or questions. The first speaker today comes from Hallam University and is also representing the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Keith Davids. He will talk about moving away from dualisms in physical education and sports science, embracing both generality and specificity in learning and practice. So are you ready, Keith?
Okay, thanks, Reda, and thanks, James, for the invitation. I'll get straight on because I've got quite a lot of slides to show. What I'm going to do today is talk about important principles of learning, training, practice in physical education and sport. One of which I think has dominated the other one. That's the kind of narrative I'm going to try and explain. Everybody understands the specificity of learning, training, practice is important. What about the other side? Generality or general physical activity and unstructured movement experiences. That seems to have been forgotten along the way. I'm just going to try and take you through a bit of a discussion about that to reconsider how you may consider the relationship between them. Okay, in many areas of science, an important feature is enrichment. Enrichment is shown to improve the lives of humans suffering from diseases, illnesses, and also animals in zoos, their quality of life. I think that the specificity generality relationship in learning, practice, training can act in the same way in sport and physical education to enrich the lives of people if we use that relationship in the correct way. And that means we need to understand it in a contemporary way. One contemporary way of understanding enrichment and understanding the relationship between specificity and generality, whether it's in skill acquisition or in transfer of learning, is through James Gibson's notion of information. If you have a look at this figure here, on this side, this is a continuum. So this is going to be a presentation of continua, lots of continuums together, rather than dualist kind of opposing ideas. At this end of the continuum, James Gibson's notion of specifying information is important. So specifying information is information that you use to regulate your actions in a very clear and useful functional way. And this forms the basis of an ecological explanation of the specificity principle, which talks about learning designs being representative. So the information in a practice, learning, training environment needs to represent or be representative of an environment, a competitive environment. So if you are boxing, you need to practice boxing. You need to engage in boxing tasks. If you're a climber, you need to climb. The thing is that representative design and specificity of transfer from practice to performance doesn't mean that this end of the continuum, where representative design is lower, i.e. there's not as much specificity, but the information is not specifying in terms of that relationship between perception and action, it doesn't mean that this end of the continuum needs to be avoided. Agreed, there are some practices at this end of the continuum that may not get the best out of learners, but there are opportunities to learn activities or to engage in experiences and activities at this end of the continuum or along the way, which could be useful for the athlete in different ways. Not just the way of engaging in specific learning and training, but actually it may enrich them so that when they do specialize, when they engage in high specificity practice, they're enriched, they're empowered, and they can get more from the practice design. So the issue becomes really, if you think about it, one of how much time you spend here and when, and how much time you spend in other locations. Now, I'm not a coach or teacher. I'm a theorist. I'm interested in scientific principles, motor learning. And so it's for coaches and teachers to make that decision. But I suggest that the decision will be made on the basis of an individualized approach, what each individual learner needs at a particular time. And I will even argue, or show you some models that argue that even at the elite level of performance, you would think that most of your time, if not all your time, should be at this end. I would argue that there's some value in elite athletes exploring unstructured play and practice and more generalized activities for a proportion of time. Another ecological notion, concept that's important in understanding this enrichment perspective, which basically means how can we conceive the complementary relationship between specificity and generality of practice and learning. Another important concept is affordances. And again, we have here's the continuum at the bottom here, and you have an affordance landscape. So according to James Gibson, an affordance is an opportunity or an invitation to act. In the introductory talks, James talked about his passion for understanding how the environment shapes our behaviors. In ecological psychology, it's important to understand how the environment can shape your health, your physical activity, your performance, but your learning is quite important as well. How it can shape your learning is that the affordances available in an environment changes. At one end of the continuum, this is the specialized, highly specific end. In some learning designs, you have highly specific affordances. So these shapes conceptualize or try to capture graphically an affordance. So the affordances are narrow and they're quite limited. They're highly specific to a context. At the other end of the continuum, the shapes are varied. So the affordances are varied and quite extensive. And this is where the less structured, the more general types of activities exist on that continuum. Activities have affordances somewhere along that line. So the decision for the practitioner, the teacher, or the coach is to look at each individual learner in physical education and sport and try to understand where they need to be on that affordance landscape. Where do they need to be at that particular time? It doesn't mean that they should be there, located there all the time. What that means is that the opportunities or invitations for action can vary for different learners on that landscape according to their needs and according to the coaches working with those, coaches and teachers working with those learners. Okay, so this is the, if you like, the specific question or issue I'm trying to explore in this brief 30-minute talk. Why hasn't physical education and sports science paid enough attention to enrichment? And some of you might argue, well, actually there has. And I'd love to have a discussion and to talk about some examples where you think that enrichment has been used in sport, physical activity at all levels of performance, whether it's elite, sub-elite, even with aging individuals, children, for example. But one of the reasons why physical education and sports science hasn't paid enough attention to enrichment in learners is because of the tendency in sciences, lots of different sciences, to they love dualisms. They love to counterposition concepts and ideas against each other all the time. And there are many examples of science, of dualisms in science. that we can go to, including the specificity versus generality, specificity of generality of practice, transfer, learning, training idea, counterpositions against each other. And I just want to briefly take you through, very briefly, take you through the history of motor learning and physical education, of how that counterpositioning, that dualism, emerged in our area, which of course affected the way that we view these concepts. Franklin Henry, great motor learning theorist in the USA, contributed enormously to our understanding of the specificity principle in learning. This guy was very talented in lots of different ways. He had an engineering background, was a technologist, and he studied physical education, and he took a very scientific view in physical education. But at that time, when he was studying and contributing to it, specificity and generality in learning motor skills were counterpositioned against each other. And when you look at the papers, they tend to have this in there. There's a lot of versus, counterpositioning. There's not as much emphasis on complementarity, integration, using these approaches together. Now, this is not to knock the massive contribution to our understanding that people like Franklin Henry have made, but it's to, if you like, almost like stand on the shoulders of giants, to build on their great work, to say, well, what we now know is that maybe there's a different relationship to be conceptualized between these two approaches, rather than to counterposition them. And you need to understand why they were counterpositioned at that time. Sorry. So here's some other examples of the dualist emphasis in motor learning research at the time. And again, there's that word in the title of the paper. There it is, it appears again. And this, over decades, you can see the counterpositioning that was going on. And the reason was, if you look at it, that's another lecture, another talk really to go through it in detail. But at the time, there was this big issue that physical educators and coaches, teachers were addressing at the time. And the issue was, do we spend our time designing learning environments or structuring learning environments to produce the best athletes in soccer or climbing, swimming, whatever the particular specific sport or context is? Or do we try to identify them? And if we do try to identify them, then are there tests that we can use which, if you like, they're the tests of their general motor capacities, which can then predict their ability to become a better, a good soccer player, or a team games player, or a climber, or a runner, or whatever. And that's where the versus, the counterpositioning came from. This notion that it was almost like a filter, a lens, the way to examine the two approaches, specificity and generality. Do we improve our practices, our learning, or do we try to select or identify athletes to become the best athletes in a particular sport? And that took researchers down a particular avenue instead of another avenue, which I'm suggesting that, well, I'm exploring at the moment. Quite a few colleagues are in our area. So interestingly, in applied sports science, they took a different approach. They actually took this integrated approach. So you got Anatoly Bondarchuk's work on, he talked about the unity of specificity and generality of practice. Basically, his argument, again, there's the continuum, but essentially he argued that it's very important for coaches and teachers in physical education and sport to spend time in preparing athletes, giving them general physical preparation, as he called it. It's also important to do specialized training. So this is where we're starting to get away from the verses, but we're trying to understand the relationship between more general, less structured maybe practices and activities. And by general, I mean those that are not specifically related to a particular sport or context. And how much time should we spend in both those types of practices and when? Bondachuk concluded that a mix of general physical practice and specialized physical preparation was needed. And he actually came up with a continuum idea that you started with more general activities, then you moved to slightly more specific, you became more specific, and gradually you specialized until you worked at a more competitive level of performance, i.e. kind of an elite level. And so this maps neatly onto the ecological approach, the continuum for representative design. So his basic idea, Bondachuk's idea in sports science was, we should start down here, enriching the athlete, making sure that they are generally well prepared, and that will then enrich them and empower them to perform the best that they can in practice and learning at this highly specialized end, with more representative designs. And this is Bondachuk's continuum here, which aligns very well with the athletic skills model continuum, which is the model of learning, practice, training that comes from the Amsterdam group, part of the Ajax Football Academy, but also the Free University of Amsterdam is a group of researchers there. And this is, again, a continuum. So you can see moving away from this, well away now from this versus counterpositioned approach, but looking at a continuum approach. And what the athletic skills model continuum says is that for young children, they really need to engage in multi-sports, a lot of varied sports and activities, rich, varied opportunities, affordances, quite varied and rich, extensive, to enhance their athleticism. Then you get this interesting phase here. This is a good contribution from this practitioner-led model, the athletic skills model of donor sports. The notion that if you want to become a good footballer or a good climber or a good judo player, then there are certain sports that you can engage in that will help you to become a good football player, climber, or judo player. Hence, they're called donor sports. So they're more, they are varied. You're not too specialized in the training, but there is a specific aim to enhance your specialization. So you can see that this concept of enrichment is not stated in this model or that model, but the ecological concept of enrichment is there in the notion of donor sports. And this is the more specific end of the training. Even in the technical adaptive training, when you decided I can specialize as a football player or a climber, there should be some variability in there. It's not just repetitive, but it's more in line with Nikolai Bernstein's notion of repetition without repetition. That is that what you repeat in training, specialized training, is not so much technical movements, but the solving of movement problems that you face in competition, repetition without repetition. The athletic skills model says that at the elite level, at least some proportion of time should be spent at this end here. So you will see elite athletes engaged in more multiple sports to refresh their enrichment, as it were. Okay, so from an ecological perspective, what you can take is that this is the sort of dynamical model here. So this ball represents the learner performing in this dynamical landscape, and these represents attractors or stable states of coordination. And with high specificity of practice, this is what happens to your perceptual modal landscape, representing, conceptualizing as a metaphor, the learner's ability to engage with a performance environment. What this means is that you get quite stable, deep wells of attraction for an individual to perform in. They can become too rigid. So the force is needed to perturb the individual away from a rigid, stable, highly stable performance. of a particular skill, they have to be quite extensive. The effects of generalized practice is to soften the landscape, to reduce the stability of these wells, not in a negative way, which makes the movement patterns unstable, but more to help the learner or the performer to become adaptable. So you can see here, the forces needed, the effort needed for this individual to transition across this perceptual motor landscape and find a way that works in a particular environment. The forces are less, the energies are less, and the psychological, the demand is less. So it's about, you do need stable, deep, stable regions of the landscape at times, but you also need this adaptability. So you can see that the enrichment process is about helping the individual to become more flexible, adaptable by exposing them to more general practice contexts and situations. The difference with what the ecological approach, this is explained in this paper and also in the book that's come out on physical literacy, but the explanation is really it's a theoretical scientific explanation for a practical explanation of enrichment, to say, well, you know, how would enrichment, why should we engage in enriching activities, which includes specialization at times, but also includes more general activities and movements. Well, this gives you the theoretical rationale, the scientific rationale from a dynamical perspective. Now, it's not just about elite sports. So this is obviously a symposium for physical educators as well. And we're talking about physical education across the life course. So one of the things, one of the take-home messages from this presentation is that enrichment is needed for health and well-being across the lifespan. Whether it's, we've heard about it in the different models, how enrichment can prepare children. It can help them avoid the negative problems of early specialization and practice in sports, for example, the physical, mental, social problems that are well documented in the literature. But it's not just a prerogative of young people and adults. So sports or landscapes like parkour, for example, are now being used with older people in order to sustain their health and well-being. They're useful from a physical perspective, but also useful from a perspective, mental health and well-being, the social interaction perspective, brain health as well. And what ecological dynamics does, it takes a more holistic view of the individual. It looks at enrichment from a psychological, emotional, social, and physical, all those dimensions together in a coherent way. It needs to start early. It needs, the enrichment process needs to start very early. You can't just expect people to take up sports and physical activities as young adults or later on into their childhood or even in older age, because they suddenly realize what they're told is good for you. They need to gain that base, that breadth of movement skills, of coordination patterns that they can use to navigate the landscape. And there's some, this is a historical feature of Amsterdam, but what you notice about it, it's very symmetrical as a playscape for children. And you look at other features of children's playscape. This is the group from University of Groningen in Holland. And they've, Rob Vitagen and his group, they've pointed out that there's a lot of symmetry in there. And that's good, that's okay to start with. But you do need to bring the variability in, because that adds more challenge. I guess the difference between the two goes back to what I was talking about when I talked about the affordances of such landscapes, the invitations, the opportunities for actions in such landscapes. Here, they're quite limited, they're narrow, okay to start with, but quite quickly, the children can be challenged to negotiate these landscapes, find ways to navigate around them, explore their variability, and this would provide the basis for enrichment, which they can then take into more specialized sports if they wanted to. Even maintaining physical activity and health and well-being from a recreational perspective, able to take up new sports in adulthood, and then later on in older life to be able to maintain a healthy lifestyle because they've got this enriched basis. So this in Scandinavia, this is already known. Yeah, this is already known. So you can see that there are enriched landscapes for young adults to explore, to learn how to use their bodies in different locations, to interact with the environment and not just repeat a technical movement pattern, but to be challenged in different ways. And Ryder's given me the 5-minute message, so I will bring it home now. So the take-home messages then is that to avoid the counter-positioning of specificity and generality of practice, both are important. Specialized training is important, specificity of practice is important, but not all the time. There are documented problems with taking too specialized an approach, particularly over prolonged periods. It's important to engage in specific and general practice to meet the needs of each particular individual. At some point in time, an individual might need to be highly specialized, only venturing to the more general side of the continuum for a small period of time. But for most of us, it's better to be more generalized in the activity with a small amount of time, more or less, in a specialized phase. Searching the affordance landscapes, the teachers and coaches in physical education sport need to present different affordance landscapes for individuals depending on their needs at times. Here, the athletic skills model, the essential message from that is that first train the person, the athlete, and then train the specialist later. That seems to be the message from quite a few of these scientists here. And enrichment programs can be both specific. So enrichment can occur in a specialized way, specific way. By that I mean, you don't just get athletes or individuals to just repeat ad nauseam until they're bored stiff movements. You can add variability in specialized training, specific practice environments as well. But particularly, there are great opportunities at the more general end, where you can expose people to lots of general physical activities and exercises and ways of doing things in order to enrich their lives at many different levels. So I'll finish there, Ryder, yeah?
Thank you, Keith. Lots of food for thought. And again, I ask you to save your comments and questions. And I will then be introducing you to the next speaker, who is a professor at our department at Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, Kenneth Aggerholm. He will give us a presentation on Bildung as a prime concept in Scandinavian PE and education. So you're very welcome.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ryder, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's very good to be here and physically and talk to real people or people in real life. Ryder suggested this title, and I thought it was a good title. But I took the liberty to insert a question mark because after agreeing on this title, I did some thinking, and I want to invite you to this journey that I took in my thinking around this topic, Bildung in physical education. My first thought was that it is a prime concept, and I'm going to show how it is so in Scandinavia. And then I thought, wait a minute, is it? Maybe we should explore if this claim is true. And then I had a second thought. What is it exactly that I'm looking for? This Bildung, what is it? It's a slippery concept. So I think I need to clarify what it is. And then I think it's important also to ask if it's important to interrogate these questions. Should we focus more on Bildung in physical education? So that's kind of the journey that I want to invite you to come along. So as a good researcher, I found the curriculum, and I pressed Control F to search for Bildung. I didn't find anything. We removed Bildung from the curriculum. I couldn't find this in English, so I'm sorry to the international audience. I'll translate. In the earlier curriculum, there was a purpose, and physical education was a school subject that was related to general Bildung. Now, in the new curriculum, the school subject is relevant and a central topic, a key topic, or a key school subject. So, my first research on this showed that it's not a prime concept in physical education. But then I'm a thorough researcher, so I broadened my scope and pressed Control F at the core curriculum, and bingo, I found Bildung. The school's mission is both the education and the all-round development, Bildung, of all pupils. So it is there. It's kind of the broader purpose of school in Norway. I looked further. I'm a very thorough researcher, so I looked further into the underlying principles to see how do we understand the Bildung. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but there's a long description of what Bildung is. So it is the development of the all-round person. It contains knowledge, acquisition of knowledge, but also skills and abilities, more practical side of it. So it's related to teaching, everyday school affairs, broad range of activities, developed in interaction, and also working on your own. So there's a lot of descriptions of what Bildung is in school, but I thought there has to be more to it, right? Bildung cannot be reduced to the acquisition of knowledge, and Bildung must be more than practical skills. So I thought maybe we should clarify what we mean by Bildung beyond these very general descriptions. And also, this reminds me that it's easy to get lost in translation here, right? I use Bildung, the German concept. It's translated here to all-round, develop the all-round person. It's also often translated to self-formation, cultivation. So it's quite a task to navigate in the different descriptions of Bildung. So I decided to look into the literature and see what Bildung is. And there's this general figure of Bildung. Bildung is the formation of the self in relation to the world, including other people, cultural aspects, values. So this it's kind of the most general account of Bildung. It's the formation of the self in relation to the world. So now I was preparing this speak, and then this handsome fellow came along, and he started talking about ecological psychology and ecological dynamics theory, and I thought this is interesting because there's this relational aspect that seems to appear both in Bildung. Bildung is relational from the ground. I think the same as in my new journey into the ecological psychology. I think that this it has a similar. There's a lot of similarities, and then I came to think about. I did my master thesis on biosemiotic analysis of Merleau-Ponty's concept of the body, the lived body, and he was very occupied with this Umwelttheory by Jakob von Uexküll, a biosemiotic figure in he wrote in the 1920s, and his Umwelttheory has this the functional cycle, Funktionskreis, which describes that organisms, from the simple organisms to human beings, we have specific Umwelt, we have specific environments depending on our receptor organs and effector organs. So if we, I'm not going to go into detail with this Umwelttheory, but the point is that this has informed accounts of embodiment, phenomenological accounts of embodiment, enactive theory, extended mind theory, that sort of thing, and also the ecological psychology field. So I think that there's a common ground here that's interesting to explore. And what I think is interesting with this Umwelttheory is that if you develop new motor skills, movement capability, different notions I'm not going to clarify, but if you develop or change or develop your ways of moving, then your world changes. Enrichment, the notion of enrichment, it was new to me. I think that's my thought was that this has to do, Bildung in physical education has to do with this learning to move and growing richer landscapes, movement landscapes. I thought that taking Bildung into physical education has to should involve this this process or this understanding of developing your environment, your movement and your environment. So I was happy to see that Yngvar Amundsen, my good colleagues up there, has included some of these thoughts in his account of physical Bildung. Thorburn and Stolz have also described how physical education should concern this cultivation of habits and cultivation of values. And so I think what we have here is an account of Bildung as cultivation. And very briefly, this is very, I try to pinpoint some central elements. So Bildung in physical education would involve growing environments, growing movement environments. It involves transaction and reflection. You can probably send some Dewey thoughts here. Exploration and adaptation to the environment. The content in physical education would be a wide selection of tasks and activities. The result of Bildung in this perspective would be what I think would, I try to formulate this growth of versatile movement capabilities and rich movement landscapes. So I think there's an affinity to enrichment enrichment ideas here. And also cultivating into physical cultures, right? So by experiencing these movement activities, you're cultivated into a physical culture and you can participate in those through your life. Didactics would be indirect pedagogy, organizing landscapes. Many of you know much more about these ideas. I think it's very well aligned with non-linear pedagogy. So I thought that this was a nice account of Bildung in physical education. But then I saw a new book by Gerd Biesta, and he has this thought-provoking paradox, the Parkes-Eichmann paradox. He describes that in 1961, a special tribunal of the Jerusalem District Court began the trial of Adolf Eichmann. He was a Nazi SS Obersturmbannführer, and he admitted arranging the mass deportation of Jews, but he denied responsibility for the consequences. He was just following orders, he said. So on the other side, we have in 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, she rejected the order of the driver of the bus she had boarded to give up her seat in the colored section to a white passenger. She said no. Now, Biesta argues that Parks steps forward as an I. She says no. Eichmann, he hides his own self, his I. I wasn't responsible. I was just following orders, right? So Biesta's maybe a little provocative, but I hope thought-provoking argument is that Eichmann appears as a success, and Parks is a failure. If we look at this from perspective of effective instruction and successful learning. So he's critical to the educational system today, where we present students with things that they take up and then reproduce afterwards. We should be more concerned with human beings who say no. So he argues that what's absent in Jewish theory and this idea of cultivation is the possibility for the human organism to say no, to step forward as an I. So he argues that education, the education that we need, and he connects this to Bildung, is education that foregrounds the I, who stands for the task of leading his or her own life, says no. And he writes elsewhere that Bildung is oriented towards the achievement of subjectivity or subjectness. So this self-formation in relation to the world shouldn't just be adaptation or fitting into the environment. It should be the formation of a self that is capable of saying no. Okay, so how do we develop? I thought about this Monty Python scene. You probably recollect, many of you. You are all individuals. You're all individuals. I'm not. Anyways, how do we in this Bildung perspective, how do we develop our individuality, our self, our subjectness that Biesta talks about? The grand journey, Dannelsesreisen, is a kind of typical image, image metaphor for this. You have to you have to transcend your own horizon and encounter otherness, some strange places, different cultures that transcends your horizon and makes you or represents an encounter. And Biesta describes this as being in a state of dialogue with what and who is other. Existing as a subject is not individualism. It's a way of being in a dialogue with what is other, being exposed to what is other, being addressed by what is other, being taught by what is other. So this, I thought this is an interesting counter perspective to what Bildung is in physical education, being taught by what is other, encountering otherness. So I thought, how might this look in physical education? I thought, now, Vinnie Jones, I wouldn't. I'd be careful connecting him to Bildung. But I like this image. I heard this podcast that when the crazy gang arrived at football matches, they had this ghetto blaster to intimidate the others and kind of disturb things, right? Today, when players arrive, they have Apple AirPods or headphones, probably with specially selected playlists from Spotify adapted to their musical taste. If we want to know more about the artist, we can Google and have results adapted to our taste. So there's these theories about we live in a bubble right now, right? Big data, and it's all adapted to us. So I think these headphones is a good image of how we it's difficult to transcend our horizon today. So I thought this ghetto blaster would be a good image of the educational task for to try and present students with otherness. And Thomas Sie has put this into theory, and he describes the task of the school to be to present something different from everyday life. I think and teachers should interrupt what students take for granted. So in physical education, in this perspective, it would be a bad teacher who just lets the students play basketball, football, do what they do in their everyday life. The school should be something different, something he calls it also artificial from everyday life. It should present students with otherness. My own, I've thought about my own experience with otherness in school, and I came up with this so i hul. I'm not going to try and translate that. It's an old game they played it in Denmark in the 1700s, 300 years ago. And what's special about this game is that it's about keeping one of the participants outside. So you're excluding one from the being part of the circle, and essentially the game is about finding a loser. I think that this experience stuck with me because it's radically different from any other game I've played. I think from my recollection, excluding a loser. That's quite a different social order, quite a different set of values than in other games. So I thought this might be one example of how you can present students with otherness in physical education. So if I should try and briefly sum up, I think Bildung in physical education could be described as bodily subjectification where you encounter otherness. You have experience, Erfahrung, not the experience as Erlebnis. Long story. So activities should represent good otherness. The result would be what Biesta calls subjectness, existing as a bodily subject, being the eye of movement and action. And the didactics would be direct pedagogy, not to be confused with I think it's also called the, or is it? Yeah, I think it's a term also in the ecological dynamics approach. But it's not like saying directly you should do this or instructing directly. It's directing attention to the student to kind of address the student, not just organize environments, but address the person. So that's what was meant by this, to summon the student into action, to say, hey, what do you think about this? Well, to kind of evoke this action from the students. I don't see any clock. How am I on time? Okay. Okay, so I thought this was kind of a nice, two nice accounts. I think we could call this existential Bildung versus Bildung as cultivation. I thought these are kind of nice to think with, different accounts of Bildung in physical education. But I discovered that I wrote a book about this in 2015, taking up this perspective. So I thought that was a nice one. But then I came to think about Wolfgang Klafki. He would argue that, hey, you're forgetting society. Questions concerning Bildung are questions concerning society. And he's famous for this kategoriale Bildung, between a focus on the person, learning to learn on this part of the spectrum, and then a focus on the content. So your Bildung is about knowing the classics, right? Being able to do the classic sports in physical education. So he had this dialectical account of Bildung in his early work, but later on he argued that we need to think about society. We need to. He was critical to Bildung as a way of cultural distinction. Like I'm gebildet, I'm well educated, and as kind of a way of distinguishing yourself. So he focused on general Bildung, which is Bildung for all, Bildung towards what concerns us all, and Bildung of all human capacities. So this is a very broad allgemeine Bildung, general Bildung, including many of the aspects of the others, but adding this social, society focus. One of his arguments is that the content of education should be epochal key problems, the problems that are typical for our times, the central problems. They should be both historical, contemporary, and future oriented. They should be open for different solutions, so that students would be able to come up with their own solutions and possible actions from this. And I think this idea is very closely related to the interdisciplinary topics in the Norwegian curriculum. From Klafki's point of view, I think it would be this idea would involve taking up broader societal contemporary problems, issues as part of physical education, so that you can for example, take up issues concerning gender equality. Take that up by teaching dance, show how it has been, how it could be. Nobody puts baby in the corner, right? So these ways of confronting gender issues through teaching dance, I think, could be one example of orienting Bildung towards key problems in society. So the process would be inactive. The students should think for themselves, work with these problems, find own solutions. And the result in Klafki's account would be self-determination, taking responsibility for one's own life, one's own engagement in physical cultures, but also co-determination. I think this would be citizenship. I think taking responsibility for organizing sport in society. Norwegians who have children would know that it relies on volunteers, parents to offer sport or physical activity, movement cultures to future generations. So taking part of taking responsibility in this would, I think, be part of this co-determination. And then solidarity, that we should include everyone. Everyone should be able to have this self-determination and co-determination. So problem-oriented, inactive, interdisciplinary, and exemplary teaching. I don't have time to go into details here, but that would kind of be the didactics of this perspective. So I try to present some quite complex lines of thought, and these are, of course, not as neatly organized as I've presented them here, but I think they're very intertwined, but I think that they are distinguishable in theory. They represent different ideas of Bildung. I think that this could, rather than saying that Bildung is this and then have this essential account, I think thinking with this trialectical approach to Bildung is might be beneficial, and I think they're complementary in practice. So is it a prime concept? Well, I think at least this would be a good starting point for looking into both the curriculum and practice, and see how these ideas come out in physical education. So finally, no, I have one slide left, and can you help me? Oh, no. Okay, so different question. Should Bildung be a prime concept? That's a very different question. I think my own, probably no surprise that I vote for that. I think Bildung is a way of balancing this focus on subjectivity and general content. Bildung needs both, you can say. It's this relational account. So I think that's one argument for focusing on Bildung. I think it can provide a critical corrective to focus on utility that we see in education today. Bildung is an end in itself. So I think that's that might be important. And then the most important thing is, in my view, that it can raise and debate questions concerning the purpose of education. I think Bildung is a normative concept. Many are critical to Bildung because it's normative, but I think the normativity of Bildung shouldn't be dogmatic, like you need to read this or you need to do this to be to achieve Bildung or be gebildet. So we shouldn't have this dogmatic normativity, but we need to ask why children should have physical education. Why is it important that they learn to move? What is it that we want with the children that we're working with? The purpose. I think that's very important. I think Bildung is a way of opening that discussion. I inserted some references because I have students attending this seminar, so you can read on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. Very important correction for the symposium. I'm happy that you are at the department. We are working now to develop a new 5-year teacher education, and these thoughts are very important to us. We have one more speaker before we open up for questions and comments. Håvard Loras from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology will talk about discovery motor learning in physical education and sports.
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank the organizing committee, everyone for organizing this event. I think it's a timely event and looking forward to interesting discussions. And well, for selecting this topic, I even came into my office and asked me to hold the presentation. And so, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? So, of course, I said, I don't know. Well, I started thinking that we are trying to sort of revisit the concept of discovery, right? It seems to be a concept, a word, something that sort of pops out in many different types of research, in many different approaches. And as I will get into, it sort of seems to align very well with an ecological approach and ecological dynamics. So I'll try to get into that. The reason for the sort of putting the motor part sort of in between it, because you have there's a lot of discovery learning approaches that does not deal with movement. So I think it's a good time to revisit and to see where can we go further with this concept. This is a good event for sort of sharing some ideas and see where it can take us. Okay, so just put something in perspective, just to begin with. I know we're going to talk more about the sort of the Norwegian context a little bit later, but just some call it observations from the literature. Some of you probably know these statistics from before, but so when we're discussing movement education, is there any signs that we need a new way forward, right? We need to discuss new approaches, ways of thinking around doing sports, physical education, and being active in other areas of life. So we do know that also in Norway and around the world, we see a lot of dropout from sport, right? Some of the annual figures are quite high in different sports, and I think this is quite a typical figure. This is from Norway. It's membership in sport clubs, which you typically see that up to the age of around 13, 14. The numbers are pretty high in Norway. a lot of children are involved with sports, and then there's a huge, really sort of exponential drop in participation rates. Because I'm not going to go into sort of causes, but just to put it in perspective. And what we also can see if you ask coaches and you ask their players in different teams, they sort of have different perceptions. They don't give you the same answers if you ask them about the motivational climate or other aspects. So they just seems to be sort of out of sync in a way. And the children and the adolescents might give you some other answers than if you ask the coaches directly. So something's going on. They have different perceptions of what happens in competitions and what happens in practice. And also in physical education, there was a large national survey a couple of years ago. And this is directly from their report. And you have to see that the satisfaction with physical education decreases with age. So of course, a lot of children they love physical education. There seems to be slowly sort of getting less and less sort of into physical education as a part of school. And as they say in their report, it seems to be traditional instructional based methods which is widely used. And that's not just the teachers that report that, the children also report that. So you see a lot of ball games and fitness training types of activities. So, well, at least for me, thinking about these issues, in some sense, it sort of can keep you up at night, right? Because we seems to, in some way, I was sort of losing track of them when they get to the age of 13, 14, 15. I think it's timely to sort of discuss what are the overall approaches there. It seems to sort of, are we seeing more and more dropping out of sports? They're not satisfied with, not engaged in the PE. And we know a lot of them also, they drop out of activities entirely, and they became inactive, and we have all sorts of consequences. So this sort of background gives us at least an opportunity to sort of discuss how should we develop other approaches. Okay, so well, some of this aligns with what you already heard, but just think about it. So if you are about to plan a session, right, in physical education, in sports, or other types of activities, so where do you start? What are your sort of your first thoughts, ideas, how I'm going to do it? So do you begin by thinking about instructions, demonstrations, how you're going to structure your tasks? Are you thinking about rules, regulations, etc.? Sort of, what are you going to do as a teacher or a coach in sort of getting the activity going? If this is your sort of attacking point, you might end up in focusing more on what you as a coach. So you're doing a sort of more of your approach is thinking about yourself and what you're going to do, right? Maybe. But as part of this is actually a part of the continuums that Keith has shown us. But you think more in terms of facilitating and guiding activity. If that's your starting point, that might take you in some other direction. And I just thought of this because I think actually Keith mentioned it, but if you visit a zoo, right, there are the zookeepers, and I watched this with my children this summer. That's why I started thinking about it. but they enrich. They have very narrow spaces for their animals, but they are working with enrichment, right? So they provide toys, different things to explore, and really sort of trying to give them the best life they can have, even being in a zoo. So it's like an overall approach for facilitating and perhaps guiding some of the animals' activities, letting them explore, and as they will get into, discover things for themselves. But if you look at this is a picture from a school ground. So you have a lot of asphalt, concrete, and a lot of the space is actually used for parking. So I don't think it's typical for a school in Norway, but you'll find a lot of these areas. And so what are the opportunities for children to go exploring? How does this sort of facilitate activity? I think it's sort of strange thing that we work hard to sort of get these animals the best life they can, but in terms of enrichment, we need to think more about it when we're working with our children. So a little bit more for discovery learning. So like Kenneth, when I was thinking about revisiting this concept, I got straight into the literature. And I immediately regretted it. Because for typical, it's just a whole world opening up. And trying to sort of sort this out, you see there's long lines of discussions, debates that dwells around the concept of discovery learning. So this is just to put it into context, showing you the complexity of the entire field. So there's a lot of different approaches that, in some sense, deals with this concept. So it's just a brief timeline and some historical trends, if you like. So some of it dates back to the 19th century, where you can see texts discussing the inductive versus deductive teaching, right? And which some of these ideas were picked up later in the 1960s. And even in sort of early attempts of experimental psychology, you would see that they were sort of trying out, doing more discovery-like approaches, not so much instruction, sort of perhaps more trial and error, trying different things out. There's some few attempts there. But what one of the first really papers that came out with has this explicit term. It was a 1961 paper by the American psychologist Jerome Bruner. And Jerome Bruner, of course, was into overall approaches towards education. And him, and of course a lot of other people, that was highly influential in the sort of constructivism or the constructivistic pedagogy that we'll see, especially in the 1970s, had a huge impact on the way of thinking. So, and throughout, you'll see a lot of different approaches emerging, like inquiry learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, case-based teaching, and there are many others. Some of you have probably encountered this and perhaps using some of these principles in your own work. In physical education, you'll find discussions about discovery in the 1970s, but it sort of seems to be explicitly formulated in the teaching games for understanding approach that emerged in the 1980s. Right, so it was sort of picked up in physical education. And of course, now we're discussing ecological dynamics and nonlinear pedagogy. That sort of seems to intersect the whole field, and yes, with important approaches. And some of this, of course, has its roots in a dynamical systems approach. So both physical education and sports science has seen its visits of discovery-based approaches And in more like experimental work with motor learning, there were studies coming out in the 1970s, which actually showed quite interesting results. And I'll get back to that. So a complex field and a lot of literature to revisit, and so try to find the historical lines and what and previous thoughts and ideas that we might discuss. So what it seems is that in order to define this concept, it seems to me that we're still in search for a proper definition. So if you look at Jerome Bruner's original definition, he said that discovery learning is all forms of obtaining knowledge for oneself by the use of one's own mind. So it's more into more like cognitive and mental operations than movements in his approach. But he predicted that it should be powerful effects by using this approach. And these are some of the key principles and hypotheses that sort of has emerged from this work. And this is actually also some use it as a definition. So discovery learning is where the principal content of what is to be learned is not given. Okay, so you're building learning designs and planning sessions that you will not provide the specific content that is to be learned. And Bruner and others predicted that this should, in somehow, let us being able to better use what we have learned in other forms of life, and it in some way is a better way to build knowledge and a better way to learn. And it also produces more self-sustained learners. But still, if you look at, these are just a few reviews, systematic reviews. Some of these are meta-analysis. Over the years, it doesn't really seem to be some widely accepted definition or some kind of consensus on what this concept includes. So that's, I think it's an opportunity for us to sort of see where this can fit in terms of motor learning and viewed from ecological dynamics and nonlinear pedagogy. So just a visit to a short walk through some papers generally in pedagogy. And you can tell even by the titles that there's been huge discussions regarding these methods and the different approaches towards discovery learning. So some have been really critical and saying this frankly that this does not work. Does it enhance learning? And even should there be a 3 strikes rule against pure discovery learning? So a lot of debates in general pedagogy and psychology about this concept. Well, I think that's a good thing. So it's something to discuss. It's something that seems to sort of hit a nerve, and it's something we can work with further. What all of these seems to do is to build a relatively strong case against what might be termed unguided discovery learning. So I'll try to define it. So by these perspectives, if it's just it's more like a random event, right? So if you just have a session and you literally do nothing as a coach or a teacher. So just maybe if you're in a gymnasium, you just throw some equipment out and you just stand in the back doing nothing, basically, right? So there's really no guidance and no instruction, so almost no nothing. It's really just just let them explore without any guidance. And these authors seems to build a strong case against it. And in meta-analysis of which is not sort of in movement education, but in other subjects in education, the so-called unguided discovery learning does not seem to work. But when you go to what might be defined as guided discovery learning, you actually see some decent effect sizes. Really, there's across school subjects. So that's which you can find in this in a nice meta-analysis by Alferi et al. Which look through hundreds of studies on different types and different approaches, which build a pretty strong case for guided discovery learning. I think that's an important distinction to make, because if it's discovery learning, letting sort of learners find out things for themselves, it's not unguided, it's guided. There is an active role for a teacher or a coach if you're going to use this approach. Working further with the literature, we're sort of in the middle of working with a systematic review on different studies that had tried out discovery learning or discovery-based approaches towards motor learning. So we're just in the middle of this work. We are just going to have the sort of stack of papers that we're going to try to analyze. So unfortunately, I have no sort of specific findings yet, but there's also some emerging questions that I would like to share. And here's some examples of studies. So, and some findings. So there's a couple of messages that sort of seems to be sort of unfolding, unpacking by going through this literature. And one thing is that if you use a guided discovery learning approach, you're not doing any worse than using another approach, right? So for the bare minimum, it seems to work just as fine, right? Depending on your measurements and what you're looking at. More interesting, I think it seems to sort of, there are some indications that it enhances the transfer, right? So if you're going to apply what you have learned in other contexts, it seems to sort of enhance the transfer. So that's it's just an observation, but an interesting one. But of course, it also seems to be in need for working with the definition. So how does or does not discovery learning relate to other concepts? That by looking at the different ways they have conducted their studies, looking at their protocols, definitions, etc., there are other concepts that in some way seems quite related. So focus of attention, analogy learning, implicit learning. So as a part of the systematic review, we're also going to review the different definitions and how it sort of relates to other concepts. And it's also an issue of sort of defining. So what is a guided discovery-based approach? What does it include? How does it look like? And how can you sort of distinguish that from other approaches if you need to distinguish it? So we're working on it, and we're interested in discussing these emerging questions. So I hope we'll have whole time for that. Okay, so and then I'll also like to point to some other terms, and that's if you're going to think about children or other people doing sports or physical education in environments that allows for exploring and searching, right? So you might explore, you might search, but it seems to be like another case if you are discovering something. So you can explore a certain environment, but you're not necessarily discovering anything. So you need to sort of see how we can build tasks and environments that sort of should facilitate exploring and searching, which in one way would lead to some kind of discovery and as a part of the learning process. And as Keith has showed us, this aligns on a continuum, like a continuum approach to movement education. So as I said, it seems to be build some strong cases against the unguided approach as being just simply doing nothing, and strong seems to be some evidence for the more guided or the enhanced or the more assisted approaches. And of course, if you, in some way or another, you will end up, if you don't sort of introduce some way of discovering, letting the students or the athletes discover something for themselves, you might end up being very prescriptive in your instruction. There's a related feature to this, is that it might be that we have to work with our athletes or our children in order to sort of setting the stage for them to be able to discover, right? So learning to learn, so to speak. So that's also a part of it that has to be explored. Is there something that we need to sort of prepare them, work with them in order to let them be able to do their own discoveries, because it seems to aid their the learning process. So how I'm doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to point to ecological dynamics and how this seems to align very well with a guided discovery learning approach. So if we do conceptualize the learner as a nonlinear dynamic system, as we know from ecological dynamics, so there's some key terms here: nonlinearity, self-organization, variability. If we sort of use the principles that can be derived from these important concepts, and we apply them in a sort of that also includes a guided discovery approach. You might be able to sort of cater more for individual differences. We know there are individual differences. Different people respond differently to different environments, different approaches. There are huge differences in terms of movement patterns and how they change and how they respond to different learning tasks. And sort of building in an aspect of discovery seems to be might be a part of such an approach. And of course, if you allow for discovery, you also might allow for spontaneous emerging and the emergence of functional movement patterns, in a way. And if you're concerned with maybe if you're more high-level sports, so you need to repeat, need to practice some of the same aspects in similar ways, there still might be room for some aspects of discovery that will aid in the process of developing further, even if you are on a high level. So yeah, referring to the concept of repetition without repetition. So another emerging question is that if we look at the learner-environment interactions and apply the theory of affordances, the emerging question is what kind of enriched environments really facilitate guided discovery learning. So some of the, especially in pedagogy, it seems to be that they are being discovery learning has been preoccupied with so how much instruction, right? Or you have to use less instruction. So they sort of focused on the teacher or the coach, but adopting a learner environment approach used the theory of affordances and viewed through the lens of ecological dynamics. It also points us to what aspects of the environment or enriched environments really facilitate or sort of invites guided discovery learning. It invites people to explore and do their own discoveries, which really seems to aid in the learning process. So And also from a constraints-led approach, there might be key constraints that we need to work with in order to sort of integrate the discovery. And of course, it's working with providing information, task and environmental design, but there's also an aspect, as you said, in towards how you work with this at different skill levels. So you might early on, you might see approaches that you sort of allow for a lot of discovery, a lot of opportunities, a lot of things to discover, but at higher skill levels, there might be some important things that an athlete needs to work on, and you want him to sort of, him or her, do their discoveries in that direction. That's one opportunity. So I think I hope today and the next 2 days and in the future we'll also could discuss how we might build discovery into the representative learning in science and movement education. And you have to consider there are many different movement-related contexts, so the physical education, sport, and also other leisure time school-based motor activities. And in these activities, we might have different goals and intentions of the motor activities. And discovery might work differently. It might be, and has to sort of be ingrained in the different approaches. If you discuss skill development and adaptation, physical literacy, or motor competence. So I'll welcome discussions on this concept. And I'd like to thank you for watching and listening and for having the opportunity to come here. Thank you very much.